What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be continuing our updated ranking series. I wanted to get you guys my top 24 running backs with the 2024 rookie class included in these rankings. Obviously, before we know landing spots, but I want you guys to see how I'm valuing these rookies as prospects in comparison to players who are already performing for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. So with that being said, I don't want to waste any more time. Why don't we just hop right into my first tier? So as you can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the board right now. We have the S tier all the way down to the D tier. But like we've done with the other videos, and if you haven't watched those other videos, I encourage you to go watch them at the end of this video. But we work our way from the 24th overall running back in the D tier all the way up to the number 1 overall running back in our S tier. So we will be starting at running back 24. And for me, just barely making the cut is going to be Blake Corum from the Michigan Wolverines. And this is a rookie running back where obviously we don't know the landing spot yet. But to me, there are 3 running backs in this class that I enjoy. 3 running backs that I think are going to be good NFL running backs, and Blake Corum is one of those guys. Now, obviously, draft capital and landing spot can change how I view this type of running back prospect very drastically. But when you look at what he did during the 2023 season here at Michigan, this is a guy who had 258 carries. He went for 1,200 yards and 27 touchdowns for the Wolverines. Blake Corum is going to be a very good running back, and I think the dream, the ideal landing spot that we all want Blake Corum to get is going to be going to the Los Angeles Chargers, where he reunites with Jim Harbaugh, because we know what that type of running game is going to look like, and I think that is going to be the sweet spot for Blake Corum. So if Blake Corum can get maybe 3rd round draft capital to go to the Chargers, that would be the best situation for me. Now, coming in at running back 23, that is going to be Trey Benson from Florida State. And just like Blake Corum, another rookie running back coming in this class. And you've heard people talk about how this year's running back class isn't the best of running back classes, but obviously we are going to have 3 running backs in the top 24, at least in my rankings. And you see what Trey Benson did there at Florida State in 2023. Didn't get the type of volume that Blake Corum got, but he had 156 carries for 900 yards and 14 touchdowns. And the thing I like about Trey Benson is this is a type of player who has 3-down potential. You can use Benson out of the backfield in the receiving game. You can also use him between the tackles. He's better in probably an outside zone type of scheme, but I think Trey Benson is a very solid all-around running back at the next level, a guy who I think could find his way into a starting job and somebody who could be valuable for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. Now, coming in at running back 23, that is going to be David Montgomery for me. And yes, David Montgomery is in a backfield with Jahmyr Gibbs, who we all love in Dynasty Fantasy Football, but it is hard to argue with what David Montgomery was able to put on tape in a split backfield there in 2023 for the Detroit Lions. 219 carries for 1,000 yards and 13 touchdowns. This is a good offense, an offense that is probably still projected to win the NFC North, despite Caleb Williams most likely going to the Bears, despite the rising in talent there in Green Bay. I think the Lions are probably still going to be the favorites, and this is a team that is going to score a lot of points. David Montgomery is the goal line back in this offense, and although I think that the volume is probably not going to be what we want it to be, he may be a little bit inconsistent if he's not finding the end zone, but so far it looks like the end zone is going to be something that he finds very early and very often in a lot of Lions games, and a guy that I think we can still value as a low-end running back too on our Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. Now, coming in at running back 22, for me, that is going to be Tyjae Spears from the Tennessee Titans. And Tyjae Spears was a dynasty darling on this channel for me and for a lot of the people in the Dynasty Fantasy Football community. And in free agency, the Tennessee Titans did the unthinkable, where we all felt like they were going to add a running back in the room, but we did not expect them to add a top-tier free agent. Not like Tony Pollard had the greatest of seasons, but he does get added to this Tennessee Titans offense. And it just based on the money, it does seem like they are going to be adding him to use him in this backfield. This is going to be a backfield that is going to be split in a committee approach, which does seem like that is a constant theme in the NFL these days, which obviously is affecting how the running back position is used in our Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. And when you look at what Tyjae Spears was able to do last year, splitting touches with Derrick Henry, he still did have 100 carries for 453 yards and 2 touchdowns, but I think his bread and butter is how he is so versatile in the receiving game. He's very electric after the catch, a guy that I think has a lot of talent. And even though Tony Pollard is there, I still think that there is still a glimmer of hope for Tyjae Spears, but things did get a little bit murkier. Things did get a little bit more crowded in this offense. And the reason why I feel like it even got murkier than it was before is because it seems like Tony Pollard is used in the exact same ways that Tyjae Spears is. So it's going to be hard to decipher right now, but this is an offense that we expect to take a step forward in 2024, and Tyjae Spears is still a talented player. We just got to see how he produces in 2024 as well. Now moving on to my running back 20, for me, this is where I am going to have Texas running back Jonathan Brooks. He's a rookie in this 2024 class, a guy that I think has 3-down potential, just like Trey Benson, but I think he's the most talented running back in this class. The only downside with Jonathan Brooks is he is going to be recovering from an ACL injury, so he may not be entirely healthy year one of his NFL career. Now, Jonathan Brooks, like I said, I think he's the most talented player in this class. I do think that this is a guy who potentially could get the highest and the best draft capital in the 2024 NFL draft, and a guy who I think the perfect landing spot for him would be the Dallas Cowboys. We know that he just took a top 30 visit to the Dallas Cowboys, so if he does land in this type of situation, this is a guy who is going to be very good for Dynasty Fantasy Football, and a guy who I think if he lands in that specific situation, long term, he could eventually give you running back 1 numbers. But this is a guy who right now, just based off of everything we know, we're going to be valuing him as the running back 20, and a guy who I think is going to be very solid for your Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. Now coming in at my running back 19, that's where I'm going to have Najee Harris, and he's going to be the last running back here in this D tier. This is a running back who I think right now is in a buy low window. You look at what Najee has been able to do in the NFL so far. He has basically been averaging 1,200 rushing yards and double-digit touchdowns each and every season that he has been in the NFL. But it seems like right now we are very low on Najee Harris. And I guess I'm not necessarily sure why. Maybe it's just a little bit of fatigue with Najee. But even if you look at the 2023 stats, this is a guy who was 7th overall in the NFL in rushing yardage. He went 255 carries for 1,035 yards and 8 touchdowns. Yes, this is a running back by committee for the most part. There is going to be times that Jaylen Warren is going to be used in this backfield, but it is hard for me to think that Najee Harris is not going to still be valuable. Seems like people are kind of writing him off and leaving him for dead in dynasty circles, and like I said, I think this is a guy who is a very good buy low and a guy who is still going to give you consistent RB2 numbers. And yes, they may not be the best numbers ever, and they're probably not going to be the highest of ceilings ever for a guy like Najee Harris, but this offense is likely going to be improved from its 2023 version here in 2024, and this is a guy who I still think is going to be as good as it gets for your running back 2 in your Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues, a guy who is coming in as my running back 19. Now moving on up to my C tier, coming in as running back 18, that is where I'm going to have Derrick Henry. And yes, Derrick Henry is a little bit older. This is a guy who is going to be 30 years old going into the 2024 season, but still, he is still producing at a high level for fantasy football teams. It feels like Father Time is having a hard time getting in contact with Derrick Henry. Last year, 2nd in the NFL in rushing yardage, 1,167 yards and 12 touchdowns. Obviously, the big news for Derrick Henry is he is now leaving the Tennessee Titans in free agency. He has signed with the Baltimore Ravens, and we know how efficient running backs are in that Baltimore backfield. You put him here with Lamar Jackson sharing that backfield and behind that offensive line. The Baltimore Ravens have never seen a running back as good as Derrick Henry. I think here in Baltimore during the 2024 season, even if he does lose a little bit of the efficiency on the ground and maybe the yardage isn't what we're used to, I still think this is a guy who can get anywhere between 12 and 18 touchdowns in this Baltimore Ravens offense. It would be absolutely bonkers if he gets up to that 18 touchdown number, but I think anywhere between that 12 and 18 range is where Derrick Henry is going to finish, and he's going to be very valuable for Dynasty Fantasy Football teams for at least 1 more year. Now coming in at my running back 17, that's where I'm going to put Joe Mixon, now of the Houston Texans. And yes, Joe Mixon was set to be released by the Cincinnati Bengals, but the Houston Texans came in last minute and offered them a 7th round pick just to get Joe Mixon on their roster. And it seems like the Houston Texans are loading up, obviously after the recent Stephon Diggs trade, Joe Mixon trade, along with adding a lot more to the defense in free agency. It seems like the Houston Texans are ready to contend, and Joe Mixon is going to be a beneficiary of that. We know how good Joe Mixon has been for fantasy football teams when he was in Cincinnati. This is going to be as equally as good of a situation now in Houston. You look at what he did last year, 8th in the NFL in rushing yardage, 1,034 yards and 9 touchdowns. But the good thing about Joe Mixon is he is used in the receiving game a lot. This is a guy who can give you top 12 numbers any given season. And at 27 years old, he's not as old as Derrick Henry, so that's why he gets the nod over Derrick Henry in the rankings. But time is still going to be a little bit shorter for Joe Mixon. My guess is a 2-year window here where he can still perform at a high level for our fantasy teams. Now coming in at my running back 16, that's where we're going to have DeAndre Swift for the Chicago Bears. And DeAndre Swift, last year with the Philadelphia Eagles, 1,000 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns. He's also a guy that can be used as a third down running back, used in the receiving game as a weapon as well. We know how good he is in that aspect. But the touchdowns for DeAndre Swift were pretty low in 2023. Obviously, I think all of us know why that is the case. It seems like every time the Eagles got within sniffing distance of the end zone, they were lining up for a tush push. So Jalen Hurts saw those touchdowns instead of DeAndre Swift. But Swift now going to Chicago, he gets to play in an offense with DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Cole Kmet, and new rookie quarterback Caleb Williams. I think this is a good situation. Hopefully they are going to use him a little bit more in the receiving game, and hopefully he's going to be used on the goal line more as a rushing running back. There's still running backs there like Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson who will probably be in the mix a little bit, but I do think that this is a guy who is a middling running back too for Dynasty Fantasy Football purposes, and that's why he's coming in as my running back 16 in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now coming in as my running back 15, that's where I'm going to have Javonte Williams for the Denver Broncos, and he is going to be the last running back here in the C tier for me. This is a guy who I had very high expectations coming into the league as a rookie. Obviously, the first year he was more of a change of pace backup type of running back, and then he suffered a major knee injury that has forced him to miss time and now be inefficient in his third year in the NFL. But when we look at Javonte Williams, this is a guy who is still 23 years old going into his 24-year-old season. Last year for Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos, he had 217 carries for 774 yards and 3 touchdowns. Also a guy who can be used in the receiving game. The only issue right now is that Jaleel McLaughlin showed up and he showed that he could probably be a weapon for them in the receiving game as that third down back. I still think that Javonte Williams has some potential, and we know that Sean Payton, when he has a running back that he likes to lean on him heavy. Look at what he did with Alvin Kamara there in New Orleans. I think Javonte Williams, this is probably going to be a make or break year, and obviously the last year of his rookie contract, but for me, he's going to be sitting as my running back 15 in Dynasty at the top of this C tier. Now coming in as my running back 14, that's where I'm going to have Kansas City running back Isiah Pacheco, and he's going to be the first player in this B tier for me. Isiah Pacheco, during the 2023 season, had 205 carries for 935 yards and 7 touchdowns. Pacheco, obviously the guy who was a 7th round pick that came in and beat out Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and Pacheco has really not looked back ever since he earned that starting job from Andy Reid in the Kansas City Chiefs. And I think for Isiah Pacheco, he is very limited, I think, as a running back. He is a guy who is a very hard runner. I mean, you see the memes where people say he's trying to like stomp through the ground. This is a guy who runs very hard. He's just very one-dimensional. I don't think he has a lot of upside as far as a receiver goes. So if you're playing in PPR leagues, this is a guy who's probably not going to get you a lot of PPR points, but he is going to give you about 1,000 yards and maybe even close to double-digit touchdowns in an offense like this. Those types of players are going to be valuable for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. And with Pacheco still being young, I think this is a guy who probably is going to earn himself an extension with the Kansas City Chiefs. You just always have that fear in the back of your mind with Pacheco is, are they going to look to add another guy? And if they add another guy, is he going to kind of do the things that Pacheco can't, which is going to make him a little less valuable for Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. But for right now, I think this is a guy who's going to be very productive, and you probably don't have to pay a lot to get him on your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams in the trade room. I know in startups, he's not necessarily the most expensive guy either, and a guy who I think I would be valuing as a high-end running back too on my Dynasty Fantasy Football roster, and that's why he's coming in for me as my running back 14 overall. Now coming in at running back 13, that's where I'm going to have Josh Jacobs, and Josh Jacobs had a little bit more of an inefficient season there in 2023. He was a little banged up as well. He played in 13 games and he had 800 rushing yards for 6 touchdowns. So not the greatest season from Josh Jacobs. It wasn't necessarily what we were used to out of a guy like Josh, but he's 26 years old. He signed with the Green Bay Packers in free agency here. We talked about a little bit earlier how this team is up and coming in the NFC North. Green Bay being led by Jordan Love, obviously making a run there in the playoffs last year. I think this is a team that is going to score a lot of points in 2024, and Josh Jacobs should be a huge beneficiary of that high-scoring offense there in Green Bay. The Packers also released Aaron Jones. They released him. He's now with the Minnesota Vikings, so it does seem like Josh Jacobs and A.J. Dillon, who's been pretty non-invasive for fantasy football purposes, to that RB1. I do think Josh Jacobs has high-end RB2, maybe even low-end RB1 type of upside in this Green Bay offense, and depending on how many touchdowns he scores, it could get even higher than that. But right now, for me, coming in as my running back 13 in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now, coming in at my running back 12, that's where I'm going to have James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. And James Cook showed up and showed out in 2023. It seems like when the offense started to lean on him, James Cook certainly started to cook himself. This is a guy who finished 4th overall in rushing yardage, 1,122 yards, and he was able to ball out for our fantasy football teams despite only scoring 2 rushing touchdowns. He can be used in the receiving game, and he has also proved to us now that he can be used in the rushing game with a heavy workload. This is an offense in Buffalo who's recently moved on from Stephon Diggs. They're going to be leaning on some of these weapons that they have right now, specifically Dalton Kincaid and James Cook. He's going to be a big part of this offense moving forward, and a guy that I think is going to have low-end running back 1 potential for us, and a guy who is still young enough that we can feel very confident in a 2 or 3 year window at the running back position with James Cook, and that's why he's coming in for me as my running back 12. Now, coming in at running back 11, this is where I have Kenneth Walker III for the Seattle Seahawks, and Kenneth Walker, a very talented running back, but it does seem like he doesn't necessarily get utilized as a 3-down back. We know that they used a 2nd-round pick in 2023 on Zach Charbonnet, and this is also another running back by committee. And if we're being honest about Kenneth Walker, I do think that this is a guy who is probably overvalued in Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. I think he's more of a 1A in a committee type of backfield, but it seems like a lot of people are still very high, probably in the top 10, top 9 type of range on Kenneth Walker. You look at his 2023 numbers, he had 219 carries for 900 yards and 8 touchdowns, and this is the Seattle Seahawks team who is going to be moving on from Pete Carroll, obviously new head coach in town. Going to be a new look offense most likely as well. I think obviously Kenneth Walker is still a guy that we like in Dynasty Fantasy Football. I mean, he's 23 years old. We are very confident in the youth and in the talent of Kenneth Walker. The opportunity is probably just not going to be massive for Kenneth Walker, but I do think his talent is better than some of the guys that we've talked about in this tier with him. But this is a guy who I think at best is probably going to give you low-end running back 1 numbers, but also I would not be surprised if he falls in that running back 2 range in 2024. Now, coming in at my running back 10, that's where I'm going to have Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Rachaad White is a guy who broke out in the 2023 season. Another guy who, when we look at the guys like James Cook and Kenneth Walker, is still young as well. He's a guy who's still on his rookie contract. He is used as a 3-down back. He has that 3-down back type of potential. He is going to be used in the receiving game as a weapon. Also, obviously, in the running game in 2023, he had 272 carries for 990 yards and 6 touchdowns. I think as long as he is the primary running back in this backfield, which I don't necessarily expect the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to be drafting a running back high in this year's class, I do think Rachaad White is going to be used like a workhorse like he was in 2023, and a guy who in this 2-year window that we have with him is going to be very good for Dynasty Fantasy Football purposes. That's why right now he's falling inside of my top 10 at the running back position and the top player for me here in this B tier. Now, moving on to my running back 9, and the first player in this A tier, it is going to be Achane for the Miami Dolphins. And this is a very polarizing player in Dynasty right now. In 2023, he played in 11 games. He obviously missed some time with some injuries, and I think that that is a lot of the concern for Achane. He's a little bit smaller than people want, which was a concern as a prospect. So him coming in as a rookie and missing time due to injury didn't necessarily help that type of argument for the knock on Achane coming in, but it is hard to knock what he was able to produce in those 11 games. Just over 100 carries for 800 yards and 8 touchdowns. He was hyper efficient with the football in his hands. Also a guy who is used in the receiving game as well. And we know that Raheem Mostert led the NFL in touchdowns in 2023, but Achane has been super talented and he played behind Raheem Mostert this year. I can't even imagine what the numbers of Achane would look like if Raheem Mostert was not in the picture. We know that they have extended him, basically giving him some funny money on the back end of this contract that he's currently on, just as a good job for last year, obviously. But Achane going into his 2nd year in the NFL and being as young as he is, I have to assume that this guy is the plan for the future of this backfield. And if he gets involved a little bit more here in 2024, I think this is a guy who we could see perform with those running back 1 numbers on our Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. Hell, we saw him win us some weeks last year just by himself. There's just always going to be that little bit of risk, I think, with Achane, especially being in this committee backfield and also being a little bit of an injury risk, I think, as well. That's where the risk is baked in, but it's hard to knock him anywhere outside of this A tier. And I think a guy that a lot of people are going to be very excited about. And like I said, a polarizing player, but for me, he's my running back 9 in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now, coming in at my running back 8, that's where I'm going to have Travis Etienne for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the year that Travis Etienne put together in 2023 was a little bit weird, I would say, because you look at that first half of the year, he was absolutely balling out. In the second half of the season, he really kind of fizzled out, and I think this offense fizzled out entirely as a whole. And Etienne kind of just faded away for our Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. But when you look at the year as a whole, 17 games played, 267 carries for 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns. That's a pretty good running back for your Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters. Now, the consistency was an issue, and that's obviously something we want to see get better. But you look at this Jacksonville Jaguars team, and they've just lost Calvin Ridley. We know that the division is getting better around them. It's probably going to be a little bit more competitive. They're going to need to lean on a guy like Etienne in this offense and get him going just so they can stay competitive in the AFC South. Also, I think an underrated thing with Travis Etienne is he was a first-round pick in the NFL draft, so he is going to have that fifth-year option on his rookie contract, which I think is going to be good for him because it's going to give him the added flexibility for the consistency to stay here in Jacksonville, which obviously we want to see those running backs keep getting second contracts with the original team that signed them. But for me, Travis Etienne, he is going to be coming in as my running back 8 and a guy I think we can view as a mid to low end RB1. Now coming in at my running back 7, that's where I'm going to put Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles now. Saquon Barkley going to the Eagles in free agency, and honestly, this is going to be the best offensive line that he has played around, even though Jason Kelce has retired and moved on from his NFL days. And this is most likely going to be the best offense that Saquon Barkley has ever played on as well. I think there is going to be a very good 2-year window here for Saquon Barkley, and a guy who I think could truly contest for the running back 1 in 2024. The only downside with Saquon Barkley compared to some of the other guys that I have above him is the age. He's approaching that running back age cliff. He's just a little bit older than some of those guys. And no knock on Saquon Barkley. All of the guys ahead of him are super talented. Saquon is as well. And despite playing for a very bad Giants team in 2023, he still produced 247 carries for 962 yards and 6 touchdowns. I think this is a guy who we can lock in as our running back 1 on our lineups and feel very good about Saquon Barkley. Like I said, age is probably just knocking him down a little bit here, but the window is still going to be great for Saquon Barkley, and that's why he's coming in for me as my running back 7. Now coming in at running back 6, that's where I'm going to have Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams, and we've talked about Rachaad White being a breakout and how good Achane looked last year. There has been nobody who broke out harder and who looked better than Kyren Williams did during the 2023 season. This guy came completely out of the blue, and yes, we liked Kyren Williams when he was coming into the NFL, but the rookie year, it was like, what happened to Kyren Williams? Nobody likes Kyren Williams. He has basically been forgotten by his own coaching staff, and then he goes into the 2023 season and he balls out. 1,144 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns, used in the receiving game, a 3-down back, and it doesn't look like anything is really going to change going into the 2024 season because free agency has came, it has went. The Rams have not addressed the running back position, and it seems like they are comfortable moving forward with Kyren Williams. As long as he's in this offense, as long as he has that bell cow type of usage, he's going to be a top fantasy football running back for our fantasy football teams, and also a guy who's going to be very young as well, so we know there is going to be a lot of tread left on these tires. Kyren Williams coming in for me as the running back 6 in Dynasty and the top player in this A tier. Now moving on to my S tier, I have 5 running backs in this tier. We're going to be starting off with the first one, and it's going to be Christian McCaffrey for the San Francisco 49ers, and Christian McCaffrey had an argument for being the MVP if it wasn't a quarterback award, to be honest, in the 2023 season. You look at what he was able to put together. It was a big gap between him and the number 2 rushing leader. That was Derrick Henry, of course. Christian McCaffrey coming in with 1,459 rushing yards, 14 touchdowns. He has been absolutely baller as a fantasy football asset. And ever since he's went to San Francisco, they have leaned on him, basically building this entire offense around Christian McCaffrey in this run game. The only reason why I have him as the 5th overall running back in Dynasty and why I have him as the last running back in this S tier is because of the age, honestly. And that is really the only knock that I can have on Christian McCaffrey right now. The 4 guys that I'm going to talk about above him, they are all very dominant running backs. They are all very young running backs as well. So Christian McCaffrey, he finds himself in the back end of this S tier, and a guy who I would not be surprised if in 2024 he was the running back 1 overall again. But the age is going to knock him down a little bit because I think about this as if I was in a startup, would I pick Christian McCaffrey over some of the guys ahead of him? Probably not. The age would probably make me bump him down just a little bit. So yes, with all of that being said, sorry for the little bit of rant. I just wanted to make sure you guys know that there is nothing to dislike about Christian McCaffrey. It's really just the age, I think. And so for Christian McCaffrey coming in as my running back 5 and the last player in this S tier. Now we're going to be talking about the running back 4 in my Dynasty rankings, and this might be a little bit controversial because it seems like I'm a little bit higher on Jonathan Taylor than the community is right now. I have him as my RB4 overall. We've seen Jonathan Taylor be very dominant for Dynasty fantasy football purposes, and he was good last year too, even though he missed some time to some injury. He played in 10 games. He had 169 carries. He had 741 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground. I think this is potentially the best buy at the running back position in all of Dynasty Fantasy Football this offseason, because I truly believe you are getting an S tier type of talent at a depreciated price. I think most people are probably going to view Jonathan Taylor in that A tier, or at least value him similarly to some of those assets. So if you can pay that type of price and get Jonathan Taylor, I am much higher on him. I think this offense is only going to improve with Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen as they continue to get familiar with each other. And the thing that I think a lot of people have brushed under the rug that we don't talk about enough is he got a massive extension to stay here in Indianapolis. We want those running backs to get that extension because that gives them job security. And it's not like Jonathan Taylor is old either. This is still a guy who is in his prime. I think he is going to have a great 3-year window here with the Indianapolis Colts, and a guy who I have as my running back 4 overall. Now, coming in as my running back 3, that's where I'm going to have Breece Hall of the New York Jets. And Breece Hall, recovering from an injury, obviously, that he suffered, the ACL, but it didn't matter. He balled out during the 2023 season. He played 17 games, went for 223 carries for 994 yards and 5 touchdowns. And this was an offense that leaned on the run game, obviously with Aaron Rodgers tearing the Achilles early on. This was a team led by Zach Wilson, which meant they had to lean on Breece Hall. We talk about these running backs that can be used as a 3-down running back. All of these players in this tier can be used that way. Breece Hall is very good at all of those things. This is a guy who you can set and forget as a high-end running back 1 in your Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. And for me, he's going to be coming in as my RB3 overall. I think this Jets offense is going to improve in 2024 with Aaron Rodgers under center. And there should be many more touchdown opportunities on the horizon for Breece Hall here in the 2024 season. Now, coming in as running back 2, that's where I'm going to have Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. And we talked about this being a little bit of a committee. It did not matter for Jahmyr Gibbs. He absolutely balled out as a rookie in the 2023 season. 182 carries for almost 1,000 yards and double-digit touchdowns. It is absolutely bonkers what Jahmyr Gibbs was able to do in a limited amount of touches, because it seemed like early on everybody was like, man, if we could just get Jahmyr Gibbs the ball, he would be so good. And it seemed like it was doing that for like the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then Jahmyr Gibbs got rolling. Jahmyr Gibbs became a league winner for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. And I think if he gets a little bit more involved in year 2, in year 3, as they continue to trust Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit more, and then obviously as David Montgomery gets a little bit older in this offense, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be that type of running back that could be the best running back in football, could be the RB1 in 2024. He has that type of upside, that type of potential. I think this is a set and forget high-end RB1. Like I said, all of these guys are going to be that. But we could really be looking at one of the best fantasy football assets at the running back position for the next 5 years when we're looking at Jahmyr Gibbs. And then coming in as my running back 1 overall, it is going to be Bijan Robinson for the Atlanta Falcons. And Bijan Robinson, this is a running back who we deemed as a generational talent. That talent has not walked away. That talent was suppressed by terrible play calling from Arthur Smith in the Atlanta Falcons offense in 2023. Arthur Smith is gone. He is no longer a head coach for good reasons. We obviously saw that with Bijan Robinson, and I have to believe that Bijan is going to be used very heavily in this new offense that they have there in Atlanta. Obviously, the Atlanta offense has improved entirely as a whole, because you look at their free agency, they have signed new quarterback Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is going to come in and make that offense a lot better. They also got another weapon in Darnell Mooney who's going to be able to stretch the field. This whole offense is going to be a lot better. And yes, that is going to benefit Bijan Robinson and company. If you have Drake London, Kyle Pitts, you're excited. If you have Bijan Robinson, you're excited. Bijan Robinson, for me, he is my RB1. And if you wanted to bump him down one spot, maybe you want to say Jahmyr Gibbs is the RB1, I'd probably allow you to do it. But I still think that Bijan Robinson is that dude. I think we're going to see it here during the 2024 season. And my gosh, man, when you look back at that 2023 class, when you see those running backs, looking at the 2024 class and where we have these guys on our boards with Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson, Blake Corum, look at Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson, man. We were absolutely spoiled last year, and this year we'll see it a little bit differently. But Bijan, my number 1 overall, and these guys here on this list coming in as my top 24 running backs. Now, that is all I have for you guys today. If you did enjoy the video, I strongly suggest you go watch our wide receiver or our quarterback video. Those are going to be on the channel. I will link them in the description, so go check those out if you want to watch them. And if you like this video and you don't have time to watch the other ones, the best thing you can do for me is go down and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support, and I would appreciate each and every one of you guys doing that for us. And also, we have a goal here on this channel where we want to get to 1,500 YouTube subscribers by the the NFL draft. We're at about 1440 at the time of this recording, so we need about 60 more subscribers. If you like this content, you want more content like this, we got more content coming very soon. Plenty of great content for your Dynasty Fantasy Football team. So if that excites you, consider subscribing for me down below and help us reach our goal. And last but not least, make sure you guys are a member of our Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description. I think we're going to be doing a bonus trade show here next weekend. We usually only do one once a month, but we've had so many trades submitted. We are going to be doing a second one here next weekend. So make sure you guys go into that Discord, submit your Dynasty Fantasy Football trades in the trade review channel, and we will review them for you on our next episode. And like I said, it is a free Discord, so there is no risk in doing that. With all those things out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.